This is a response to Devourage and Zencat's videos, both in turn in response to a video I posted, which was in response to another video, which was in response to another video, so we're chopping off the re's before things get really ridiculous. I've got both of the videos linked over there, right over there. So they are well worth checking out if you haven't seen them yet. Go ahead, take a look, put me on pause, watch those videos right now. I hope you gents will bear with me as I address both videos in this one, but we're at a point where some of these divergent subjects are starting to draw together. Let's start with the obvious. The question of absolute determinism versus absolute free will, the general categories of determinism and free will, and even the general utilization of the words determinism and free will are a dead horse. Absolutely. So why do we keep thwacking at it? Well, as Zencat pointed out, the term free will in particular has been applied to so many things and with so many different meanings that the use of the term is almost meaningless. And when we use it, we find invariably that we have to clarify, and this leads to further discussion. Similarly, determinism. Are we talking about determinism as far as causal relationships in the world around us? Are we talking about determinism as far as relationships between the concepts and actions of our minds? Are we talking about determinism as a relationship between the two? Again, we have to clarify, and thus we are guided to further discussion. And that is why we continue asking these questions. Not because determinism and free will is a question in and of itself that can be productively investigated, but rather that in investigating it, we are naturally drawn to subjects where a little bit of investigation can yield a great deal. When we talk about determinism in the human mind, it was asked if thought itself is causeless. That's not the case. I do not think that thought is causeless, but rather I think that concepts, the operation of the human mind, represents a different order, a different sequence of causation, a different mechanism of correlation that we need to investigate independently. One potentially contentious example of this, and one that I'm fond of drawing in, if only for its ability to provoke conversation, is pattern. Pattern is, I believe, a construct of the human mind. It's one of the ways in which we streamline information in our environment in such a way that we can reasonably act, and act in reasonable time. That being, swift enough action that the passage of time does not alter the circumstances in such a way that those circumstances upon which we were basing our decisions have become so irrelevant, have been changed so much, that our decision can no longer be really intelligibly correlated to the circumstances in which we were deciding. Pattern is one of the ways that we speed up this process. But does pattern exist outside the human mind? Perhaps, but certainly not in the way that it exists in the human mind. As Devourage pointed out, there is no absolute correlation between one circumstance and another. Every event, every object, every action, every phenomenon is ultimately unique. The real problem is that the number of variables that make it unique are not known, and cannot be known. When we compare two things and say that they are similar, we may be able to say that they are similar in a specific way, that in regards to this trait or this property, they are similar. We cannot say that they are similar in any general sense, because we cannot know how the properties that we observe, the properties that we can see, and in particular those properties by which we say that they are similar, correlate to those properties that we do not see, correlate to those properties that we do not know. And as such, we cannot really say that this similarity in this specific property that we have identified is in any way significant to the whole. We cannot describe general similarity, only specific similarity. And in this way, pattern breaks down very quickly when we try to extrapolate it from our minds into an empirical construct. When we try to say that pattern exists in the world in the way that it exists in our minds. This is but one example of the ways in which our mind generally deals with the complexities of perception, and does so through an extremely complicated process. One of the difficulties that we find in any of these pursuits is that the mind is so keyed to complexity, to handling a vast array of data in a relatively short amount of time and producing relatively actionable results, that getting to actual simplicity in our thought and our argument is actually quite difficult. And this is where we get into problems of intuition, empathy, how the mind produces these staggeringly complicated concepts in a very short amount of time and presents them as relatively simple propositions. What we are engaging in right now is an incredibly complicated process, not because the steps in sequence are complicated. Quite the contrary. It is the simplicity of the construction of this form of argumentation that makes it difficult. Because as our mind natively, naturally operates at a very high order of complexity, consider, for example, the complexity in relatively simple statements of desire, or emotion, or spontaneous apprehension, that which we know. As our minds natively deal with this level of complexity, working through a sequence, again, a simple thread of argumentation, constructed of simple concepts, appears to be difficult. We must, through a complicated series of abstractions, projections, and constructs, transition between this native complexity to this affected, this forced simplicity. And in this action of simplicity, in the abstract sequences from which we transition into simplicity, from the construction of these simple concepts and simple identifiable relationships, we also wind up creating something very complex. We have transitioned from the native complexity of the mind to the comparative simplicity of argumentation, and in the simplicity of argumentation, find ourselves constructing that which is also very complex, although still much simpler than the native operation of the mind. And in this complex construct, we are attempting to identify relatively simple, in terms of the native language of thought, relatively simple operations. This may seem to be a problem of infinite regression, wherein we are constantly transitioning between orders of extreme simplicity and extreme complexity, either through extremely simple or extremely complex means, forming extremely simple or extremely complicated relationships between these thoughts. And indeed, we may well have a problem of infinite regressibility here. But consider, this is what occurs in all human thought, whether something which seems relatively simple, like, I would like a sandwich, I am thinking about wanting a sandwich, or even just the spontaneous desire of, I want a sandwich, or something like the constructed argument that we're engaging in right now. All human thought involves this constant transitioning between orders of complexity with such speed, flexibility, and capability that it generally passes without our notice. One of the big problems with any philosophy of the mind is that the moment that you have identified something, the moment you have identified the complexity of thought, you must immediately recognize that in doing so, in recognizing complexity of thought, you have instantiated or initiated a still more complex construct. That however complicated our model may be, it is contained in something that is more complicated still, simply by virtue of its capacity to produce or contain such a model.